The air in Marcus Vedius Pollio's villa, overlooking the shimmering bay of Naples, was thick with the scent of roasted peacock and unbridled power. It was a summer evening, 23 years before the birth of Christ, and the setting sun cast long, judging shadows across mosaic floors intricate with scenes of forgotten myths. Pollio, a man who clawed his way from obscurity to own everything, including his dozens of sprawling estates and the hundreds of lives bound to them, presided over a dinner table laden with luxury and tension. 7 of Rome's most formidable senators and their wives reclined on plush couches, their conversations a practiced dance of influence and veiled threats. But the delicate rhythm shattered in an instant, not with a clash of political wills, but with 3 small drops of Fernian wine. Demetrius, a young slave, froze at the edge of the dining room, a silver pitcher now trembling violently in his hands. The crimson droplets, smaller than tears, gleamed on the marble. Those tiny stains, insignificant to anyone else, would seal his fate. Pollio stopped mid-sentence, his voice, usually booming with self-importance, abruptly cut off. The senators and their wives fell into a silence so profound, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic splash of water from the ornamental fish pond that dominated the villa's central courtyard. That pond was infamous throughout Rome, not for its beauty, but for the horrors it held. Slowly, deliberately, Pollio raised a single finger. 2 hulking guards, anticipating the unspoken command, stepped forward. They seized Demetrius by the arms, their grip iron hard. The boy did not struggle. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his bones, that struggling would only amplify his torment. He had seen the consequences of clumsiness in this house. He had heard the screams echoing from the courtyard on nights when Pollio hosted his most entertaining gatherings. He had watched other slaves walk towards that black, churning water and never, ever return. The pond was home to lampreys, monstrous moray eels imported from the treacherous waters off Sicily. They were specially bred for their immense size and terrifying aggression, kept perpetually ravenous for the very purpose Demetrius now faced. The punishment for even the most minor transgression in Pollio's household was a live descent into that watery maw. The eels could strip flesh from bone in mere minutes. Pollio had timed it, turning agony into a morbid science. Demetrius was dragged, his feet stumbling, towards the courtyard. The black surface of the pond stretched before him, an abyss anticipating its next meal. He could already discern the sinuous shapes moving restlessly beneath the surface, hear the sickening, wet sounds of creatures slithering, eager for sustenance. The dinner guests had risen from their couches, not to intervene, but to watch, their eyes fixed on the unfolding spectacle. One senator's wife, a matron famed for her piety, wore a faint, chilling smile. Another, paler, looked away, but did not move, did not object. She merely bore witness, a silent observer to what Roman hospitality, in its darkest form, apparently encompassed. Then the impossible happened. From among the silent, watching guests, a man stepped forward. He was younger than the others, quieter, a senator who had spent the evening observing rather than speaking. His name, tragically, remains unrecorded in the fragmented accounts that survive, yet his actions echo through 2 millennia. He positioned himself directly between Demetrius and the predatory darkness of the pond. He looked Pollio squarely in the eye and uttered words no guest, no Roman, dared speak to his host. Words that brazenly challenged a wealthy man's absolute, unyielding right over his own property. "What is about to happen," he declared, his voice cutting through the heavy silence, "is wrong." Pollio's face contorted, a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The audacity! This guest had violated every sacred rule of Roman social conduct. A man's slaves were his own, his absolute dominion. What he chose to do with them was, by every societal decree, nobody's business. To interfere was an unforgivable insult to the host's dignity, a direct assault on his judgment, a sacrilegious suggestion that his form of entertainment was somehow improper. The confrontation, a silent battle of wills and social codes, stretched for several agonizing minutes. The other guests remained frozen, unwilling, or perhaps too fearful, to support either side. Finally, Pollio made a decision, one that offered a chilling glimpse into the heart of Roman elite culture. He released Demetrius, not because he suddenly agreed that feeding human beings to eels was morally reprehensible. No, his reason was far more pragmatic. The confrontation had utterly ruined the entertainment. A spectacle, by its very nature, demands enthusiastic, complicit spectators. A single, vocal objection transforms theater into awkwardness, a lavish horror into an embarrassing scene. But Pollio did not forget, and Pollio did not forgive. The guest who dared to intervene, whose name history itself seems to have conspired to erase, would face consequences that would quietly unfold over years. Subtle, insidious destructions of reputation and opportunity, impossible to trace directly back to this summer evening, yet undeniably originating from this very moment. This moment when someone suggested that Roman elite entertainment had finally crossed an invisible, unspoken line. Here is what you must understand about Marcus Vidius Pollio. He was not considered exceptional among Rome's elites. He was not shunned for his lamprey pond. He was not excluded from polite society. He continued to host dinners attended by Rome's most powerful families, his reputation largely intact. His only perceived mistake, in the calculating eyes of other Romans, was being too obvious about practices that his peers conducted with far greater discretion. The Roman elite, a class shrouded in marble facades and public declarations of virtue, systematically maintained and erased secrets from their official histories. What has survived in the historical record, preserved in stone and parchment, is often only what could be openly admitted, what aligned with their carefully curated public image. What did not survive, what was hidden, denied, and deliberately destroyed, reveals a ruling class whose private practices exceeded anything their grand monuments and public pronouncements suggested. Tonight, we will unearth some of these buried truths. Not the well-documented crimes of mad emperors, which have been chronicled extensively, but the far more insidious crimes of ordinary aristocrats. Senators who sat in judgment of others while practicing abominations in their own homes. Matrons celebrated for their virtue, who participated in rituals that would have meant death for common citizens. Families whose names represented Roman honor for generations, while their private conduct violated every principle they publicly championed. These were not isolated incidents. This was a systematic fabric of behavior, woven across centuries by a ruling class that firmly believed their immense wealth and exalted status exempted them from the very moral standards they so rigorously imposed on everyone else. The evidence, ruthlessly destroyed by those who committed these acts, sometimes survives in the most unexpected places. Private letters that narrowly escaped burning, vivid graffiti preserved by volcanic ash, oblique mentions in legal documents that hinted at crimes without fully describing them, archaeological remains that whisper stories, written records tried desperately to silence. What you are about to hear comes from those surviving fragments. They are pieces of a vast, complex puzzle that Roman elites spent centuries trying to ensure would never be assembled. They failed, and tonight, more than 2,000 years later, their meticulously guarded secrets finally come to light. Let us begin our descent into this historical darkness, starting with what really happened at Roman dinner parties. Because the banquet, that seemingly civilized cornerstone of Roman social life, was where elite secrets were both practiced and protected, cloaked in an atmosphere of apparent respectability. You have undoubtedly seen depictions of Roman banquets in films and television. Figures reclining gracefully on elegant couches, diligent servants bringing forth elaborate dishes, wine flowing freely, civilized conversation amongst the educated and powerful. These depictions are accurate as far as they go. They simply omit what transpired after the formal dinner concluded. Roman elite banquets typically operated on two distinct levels. The first was the official dinner, known as the cena. This portion of the evening adhered to strict protocols of hospitality and decorum. Guests arrived at specific, appointed hours. Courses were served in precise, predetermined sequences. Conversation topics were carefully chosen, deemed appropriate for mixed company, for senators and their wives, for the public ear. This public face of the evening could be openly discussed, referenced in letters, or even mentioned in speeches. It was the facade. The second, far more secretive level was the commissatio. This began only after the main meal had concluded, once the formalities had been observed, and it operated under an entirely different, unspoken set of rules. What happened de commissatio was understood by all participants to be strictly private. Guests who dared to discuss it publicly violated social codes so profound that such a transgression could result in permanent exclusion from elite circles, a social death far worse than any legal punishment. A poet named Martial, renowned for his cutting wit, wrote about commissatio practices in terms that required his readers to understand implication rather than explicit statements. He referenced senators who arrived at dinners with their respectable wives but departed with other arrangements. He mentioned matrons whose behavior after the third wine course, usually a potent mix, would utterly shock their morning visitors, those who came to pay their respects to a woman of supposed virtue. He described scenes witnessed through half-open doors, glimpsed in shadow, that participants would vehemently deny the very next day. The practices Martial so cleverly implied were chillingly confirmed by other surviving sources. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, penned scathing philosophical condemnations of banquet behavior, and his criticisms inadvertently revealed the very excesses he was condemning. Pliny the Elder, a tireless chronicler of the natural world and human society, documented what he called the corruption of the dining room in terms that strongly suggest intimate activities routinely occurring among dinner guests, treated as mere entertainment. The mechanics of these hidden interactions operated through a subtle, understood system of signals. Certain gestures indicated availability, a barely perceptible tilt of the head, a specific way of holding a goblet. Certain responses indicated interest, a lingering glance, a soft, inviting laugh. Certain arrangements of couches within the dining space, or perhaps in an adjacent private room, were designed to facilitate what would inevitably follow. Slaves, omnipresent and meticulously trained, were taught to recognize these nuanced signals and to facilitate the desired arrangements without explicit instruction, their movements silent, their presence invisible. The entire intricate system functioned through implication, through suggestion, allowing all participants to maintain the delicate, convenient fiction that absolutely nothing unusual was occurring. A wealthy widow named Sophronia, living during the tumultuous Late Republic, hosted banquets that became infamous specifically for their comiciato entertainment. The historian Sallust, writing about the notorious conspiracy of Catiline, mentions her parties as gathering places for men plotting treason. But between the carefully written lines of his political narrative, Sallust inadvertently reveals something far more personal. Sophronia's parties, he noted, featured every kind of entertainment, with guests participating in activities that respectable women supposedly never witnessed, much less openly facilitated within their own homes. The slave infrastructure supporting these lavish, secretive banquets was extensive and specialized. Beautiful slaves of both genders were deliberately displayed during the dinner portion, their availability and implied purpose understood by all present. Guests could request specific slaves through subtle, almost imperceptible signals to the host. The slaves themselves, reduced to mere objects, had absolutely no voice in these arrangements. Their bodies were simply amenities, interchangeable with the gleaming silver dinnerware or the imported exotic wines. What made elite banquets particularly disturbing was this chilling combination of sophisticated intellectualism and brutal human exploitation. These were highly educated people, discussing profound philosophy, reciting poetry, debating weighty political matters, while simultaneously treating other human beings as mere objects for their entertainment, their pleasure. This profound cognitive dissonance was not experienced as a contradiction by the Roman elite. It was simply, to them, how civilized Romans lived. A surviving fragment from the Satyricon, a satirical novel written during Emperor Nero's extravagant reign, depicts a banquet at the house of a newly rich freedman named Trimalchio. The scene is overtly satirical, gleefully mocking the excesses and crude displays of the nouveau riche. But the satire works, it lands its punch, precisely because its readers, the elite Romans themselves, immediately recognize the practices being exaggerated. The intimate entertainments, the casual, dehumanizing use of slaves, the blurring of moral boundaries during the drinking hours, these were familiar enough to the Roman elite that they could appreciate the dark comedy, the grotesque reflection of their own hidden world. The banquet system, in all its dual-layered complexity, persisted for centuries because it served crucial social functions beyond mere entertainment. Alliances were subtly formed during the commissatio. Political deals, too delicate for public discussion, were sealed with shared secrets. Crucial business arrangements were discreetly concluded. The shared participation in these private, often transgressive activities created powerful bonds of complicity, making betrayal an incredibly dangerous proposition. Everyone present had witnessed everyone else's hidden actions. This mutual potential for blackmail ensured a mutual, unbreakable silence. But the banquets were only one setting for these elite secrets. What happened in Rome's slave markets revealed something even darker about Roman aristocratic values, a chilling commodification of human life that few public records dare to fully describe. Rome's public slave markets pulsed with the clamor of commerce, a sprawling, unsentimental exchange of human lives. In the forum and specialized facilities across the city, tens of thousands of men, women, and children were bought and sold annually, their bodies appraised like livestock. This was a normal commercial activity, taxed and regulated, where buyers sought general labor. Agricultural workers, domestic servants, skilled craftsmen, hardy laborers. The selection process was starkly pragmatic. Buyers assessed physical condition, practical skills, and temperament. Prices reflected utility, and transactions were recorded for tax purposes, a clear ledger of human commodity.
But Rome's elite, those with boundless wealth and cultivated tastes, rarely deigned to purchase their human property in these bustling public venues. For them, a parallel, far more discreet system existed, operating through private dealers who specialized in what the Romans euphemistically called deliciae, delights. These were slaves chosen not for their capacity for labor, but for attributes far beyond mere utility: exquisite beauty, youthful innocence, specific physical characteristics, or rigorous training in specialized, often intimate arts. The selection process for delicia was conducted in absolute privacy, far from the prying eyes of the public. It followed protocols that would have caused widespread scandal, even outrage, had they been widely known.
A dealer named Tyrannius, operating in the late Republic, amassed an immense fortune by specializing in the procurement of delicia for his elite clientele. His business records, fragments of which miraculously survived legal disputes after his death, paint a picture of a sophisticated and chilling operation. Agents deployed across the vast Mediterranean world identified promising acquisitions. Subjects, often purchased at a tender age, were then trained in specialized, secluded facilities. This training, the records euphemistically noted, included education in the arts of pleasing. Elite buyers would visit Tyrannius's private showrooms, hushed spaces where slaves were displayed in ways that meticulously emphasize the very qualities being sold. The viewing process was disturbingly hands-on. Buyers were not just permitted but actively encouraged to inspect the merchandise thoroughly to verify that it met their exacting, often unconventional requirements. The slaves being inspected, young and vulnerable, possessed no rights, no voice, no recourse. They were simply products evaluated by consumers, their fates sealed by a nod or a shake of the head. A prominent senator, Quintus Lutatius Catulus, maintained a household famous throughout Rome for the extraordinary beauty of its slaves. His contemporary, Cicero, in his letters, made references to Catulus's domestic arrangements in terms that suggested far more than mere aesthetic appreciation. The senator's exquisite collection was acquired through dealers like Tyrannius, selected according to criteria that had absolutely nothing to do with household management or practical utility. The prices for delicia vastly exceeded those of ordinary slaves. A skilled agricultural worker might cost 2,000 sesterces. A beautiful youth, appropriately trained in the arts of pleasing, could command 200,000. This enormous investment, a premium that few fortunes could bear, unequivocally indicated the true purpose of such acquisitions. No one, not even Rome's wealthiest, paid that exorbitant sum for someone merely to clean floors or serve wine. The clandestine training facilities where delicia were prepared operated in a murky legal ambiguity. What transpired within their walls was never discussed in polite company, yet their very existence was an open, if unspoken, secret. Their products were purchased, and their graduates populated the opulent households of Rome's most respected families. The eventual fate of delicia slaves, as youth and beauty inevitably faded, revealed the system's full, brutal cruelty. Slaves purchased for these fleeting qualities lost their value rapidly. Some were resold at ever-declining prices as their primary utility diminished. Some were granted a hollow freedom, cast out of households with minimal resources, left to navigate a world that had little use for their specialized, now withered skills. Many simply vanished from records, their fates unmentioned, unspoken, because acknowledging their end would necessitate acknowledging the unspeakable reasons for their initial purchase. Children born to delicia slaves faced particularly complex and tragic complications.
Roman law, in its cold efficiency, decreed that children of slaves were the absolute property of their mother's owner. This meant that children fathered by elite men on their own slaves were themselves slaves, owned by their own biological fathers. Some such children were, rarely, freed and acknowledged, usually in a limited capacity. But far, far more were sold, given away, or disposed of in ways that left no official record, their existence erased by the very men who brought them into the world. This brings us to one of Rome's darkest and most pervasive practices, one that elite families participated in extensively, while publicly condemning it with self-righteous fervor. Roman law permitted fathers to reject newborn children. A baby, if deemed undesirable, could simply be placed outside the household, exposed to the elements and whatever grim fate might follow. This practice, chillingly known as exposition, was legal, shockingly common, and profoundly horrifying. Elite families primarily practiced exposition for daughters and for children born with visible defects. A son was immensely valuable. He continued the family name, inherited property, participated in politics, extended the family's power. A daughter, however, required a substantial dowry, and too many daughters could strain even the wealthiest families. The calculus was purely financial, an unsentimental evaluation. Children who cost more than they were expected to contribute were, quite simply, not deemed worth raising. The exposed children did not necessarily die. Slave traders, with their chilling efficiency, knew exactly where to find them. Abandoned infants, if they miraculously survived their first brutal hours, became the property of whoever collected them. These traders would raise these foundlings specifically for the delicia market. Children without family, without identity, without anyone to object to their treatment were ideal raw material for training in whatever specialized arts future buyers might require. A legal case from the 1st century tells the harrowing story of a woman who, some 20 years after exposing her own daughter, recognized her being sold in a public slave market. The daughter, collected as an infant, had been raised by traders, trained for specific purposes, and was now being offered for sale when her biological mother happened to attend the market. The legal question was whether the mother had any claim to her daughter. The court ruled decisively that she did not. Having abandoned the child, she had irrevocably forfeited all parental rights. The daughter remained mere merchandise. Elite families participated in this brutal system from both directions. They exposed unwanted children who then entered the slave supply, their tiny lives erased from family history. And they purchased slaves who had originated as exposed children from other families, conveniently ignoring the tragic source. The circularity was understood, an unspoken horror, but never discussed. The beautiful slave serving wine at a senator's dinner might, in a twisted irony, be the biological child of a senator dining at the next couch. No one would acknowledge this possibility. No one would investigate. The entire system depended on a deliberate, self-serving ignorance. Emperor Augustus, concerned about population decline among Roman citizens, attempted to regulate exposure. His laws encouraged child-rearing through tax benefits and penalties for childlessness, but these laws applied primarily to the legitimate children of citizens. Exposure continued unabated for slaves, for the poor, for anyone outside the protected categories. Archaeological evidence from Roman sites includes infant remains found in locations inconsistent with normal burial practices: trash heaps, latrine pits, drainage systems. These locations scream of disposal rather than burial, abandonment rather than death from natural causes.
The sheer scale of the remains indicates that exposure was not rare, but a horrifyingly routine practice.
Elite participation in exposition was carefully masked by the involvement of intermediaries. Midwives, with their intimate access to new births, handled the actual exposure. Slave traders, with their cold efficiency, handled the collection. The family patriarch simply made a decision, a quiet word, and delegated its implementation. His hands remained clean. His conscience, conveniently, remained unburdened. The child simply disappeared, becoming someone else's problem, someone else's property, someone else's product. The exposed children who survived into slavery faced fates determined by their physical development and market value. Those deemed attractive enough entered the Delicia track. Those deemed unsuitable for that specialized market became ordinary labor slaves. Either fate originated in a parental decision that treated children as commodities to be evaluated, retained, or discarded based purely on their expected value.
But exposition was a passive, if brutal, cruelty. What elite families did actively to eliminate rivals and enemies involved far more deliberate and often sinister methods. Every elite Roman household, from the humblest senator's abode to the grandest imperial palace, contained poisons. This was practical rather than immediately sinister. Rat poison for pests, pest control for gardens, various medical compounds that, in wrong doses, could easily kill. The mere presence of toxic substances was entirely normal. What was not normal, yet was pervasive, was the sophisticated poison networks that intricately connected elite households, bound by a shared, clandestine knowledge of how to use these substances against human targets. The Roman elite murdered each other with poison frequently enough that it became an almost expected occupational hazard. A wealthy man dying suddenly in apparent robust health immediately triggered suspicion. His food tasters were interrogated, often brutally. His slaves were tortured for information. His heirs were meticulously examined for motive. The assumption of poisoning was so common that natural deaths were often disbelieved, seen merely as cleverly disguised assassinations. A woman named Locusta became Rome's most famous poisoner during the notoriously decadent reign of Nero. She was widely credited with preparing the mushrooms that killed the Emperor Claudius and the potent poison that took the life of Britannicus, Claudius's son. But Locusta, though famous, was merely the most celebrated practitioner of an art that pervaded elite society. Her skills were exceptional, her compounds deadly precise. Her willingness to use them, however, was entirely typical of her class. Elite women, in particular, were closely associated with poison knowledge. Medical preparation, the compounding of herbs and remedies, was traditionally considered a feminine, domestic art. The same intimate knowledge and careful hand that produced healing compounds could, with a slight, deliberate shift, produce lethal ones. A matron who understood herbs well enough to treat her family's illnesses understood them equally well to end inconvenient lives. The satirist Juvenal wrote scathingly about Roman wives poisoning their husbands, portraying it as so common that men should simply expect it as a marital inevitability. The satire, dark and cynical, resonated precisely because it reflected a recognized, if unspoken, reality. Marriage in elite Rome was a dangerous institution for wealthy men whose wives stood to benefit enormously from their sudden deaths. Inheritance provided the primary, most compelling motive. Roman women could own property and could inherit vast sums from their husbands. A wife who conveniently outlived her husband gained control of his estate, at least temporarily. Multiple marriages were common among elite women, each often ending conveniently once the husband's wealth had been secured, transferred, and consolidated. A woman named Sassia was prosecuted in 79 years before Christ for allegedly poisoning multiple husbands. The prosecution was led by none other than Cicero, whose fiery speech against her provides detailed, chilling evidence of how these poison networks operated. Sassia, Cicero alleged, consulted specialists, obtained deadly compounds through a web of intermediaries, meticulously tested dosages on unfortunate slaves, and administered fatal doses through contaminated food and drink. Whether Sassia was actually guilty remains a subject of historical debate. What is certain, however, is that the sophisticated network Cicero described, the specialists, the intermediaries, the testing protocols, existed and was readily accessible to anyone with sufficient money and the right connections. Sassia was prosecuted only because she was caught. Countless others, more careful, more discreet, were never prosecuted at all. The poison networks crossed household boundaries, connecting through shared servants and common suppliers. A slave purchased from one elite household and then resold to another might carry invaluable, deadly knowledge of what had transpired in the first household. Suppliers who provided compounds to one family knew who else was buying. This information was incredibly valuable, a currency of death, and was traded accordingly, for other secrets or for gold. Elite families, living under this constant, insidious threat, protected themselves through elaborate, almost ritualistic precautions. Food tasters, often slaves whose lives were expendable, tested every dish. Trusted slaves guarded food preparation areas with absolute vigilance. Cups were kept locked, secured against tampering when not in immediate use. The very existence of these elaborate precautions spoke volumes, a stark demonstration of their acute awareness of the ever-present threat. When everyone assumes poison is possible, everyone must defend against it. The normalization of poison as an elite tool extended far beyond domestic disputes. It permeated political applications. Rivals for high office sometimes died conveniently. Witnesses to inconvenient crimes sometimes failed to testify. The suspicion of poisoning was so pervasive that it fundamentally shaped political behavior. Alliances were formed, in part, on the chilling calculation of who might poison whom. But poison, for all its insidious power, was merely one tool in the elite Roman arsenal for eliminating problems, for exercising their absolute power. Elite Romans had access to methods that were far crueler, more direct, and undeniably more deliberate. Roman law granted the pater familias, the male head of the household, absolute, terrifying power over his family and, crucially, over his slaves. This power was virtually unchecked, extending even to the right to punish without external oversight. What transpired within the formidable walls of an elite Roman household was, quite literally, no one else's business. The punishments inflicted in these private domains ranged from routine beatings, an accepted part of household discipline, to torture, which was alarmingly common, and even to killing, which was entirely legal if the victim was a slave. The lamprey pond of Marcus Vidius Pollio, with its theatrical horror, was unusual only in its public, performative nature. Other households maintained their own facilities for punishing slaves, facilities that served purposes far beyond mere discipline. A letter from Pliny the Younger, typically reserved in his observations, describes visiting a friend's villa and hearing unsettling sounds emanating from a specific wing of the house. His host, seemingly unconcerned, dismissed them as mere domestic matters. The sounds, Pliny notes without further elaboration, persisted throughout the evening. Other guests, exhibiting a practiced nonchalance, simply ignored what they heard.
Pliny himself mentions it only in passing, as though such an occurrence was utterly unremarkable. What happened in those private, soundproofed spaces was sometimes discipline, yes, but it was sometimes entertainment. The line between punishment and pleasure blurred in ways that Roman sources discuss only obliquely, with evident discomfort.
Seneca, ever the moralist, condemned men who found perverse satisfaction in applying the whip themselves rather than delegating the task to professional torturers. His condemnation, while righteous, inadvertently illuminates the very practices he decried. Elite Romans personally inflicting pain on slaves for reasons that stretched far beyond maintaining household order. The training of punishment specialists was a recognized profession, a grim art. These professionals understood human anatomy well enough to maximize pain without causing immediate death. They understood psychology well enough to efficiently break resistance, to shatter spirits. They moved between elite households, sharing techniques, comparing methods, constantly refining their macabre art. Their services were purchased, like any other skilled labor, without moral qualms. Elite women, often celebrated for their domestic virtues and piety, also participated in household punishments in ways that ancient sources describe with evident discomfort and veiled disapproval. Juvenal, in his biting satires, portrayed matrons who supervised beatings with excessive, almost voyeuristic interest. He depicted them specifying methods, observing the agonizing results with visible, chilling satisfaction. The satire, dark and exaggerated, reveals the horrifying reality it mocks. Roman women of the highest social status personally oversaw the torture of household slaves, their delicate sensibilities apparently unmoved by the suffering they commanded. A legal case from the reign of Nero concerned a senator's wife who had killed a slave girl through prolonged, systematic punishment. The legal question was not whether she had the right to kill the slave, which, under Roman law, she absolutely did, but whether her methods had violated public decency by occurring over multiple days, employing specific techniques that the court, in its discretion, declined to describe explicitly. She was acquitted. Her methods remained entirely legal, but the chilling case record strongly suggests practices that extended far beyond ordinary discipline, delving into the realm of sadistic entertainment. The private punishment facilities in elite villas have even been identified archaeologically. Rooms with specific, unsettling features, hooks in walls at particular heights, drains precisely positioned for easy cleaning, specialized soundproofing construction. All these architectural details point to purposes that the physical structure reveals, even when written records remain silent or evasive. What makes these practices particularly disturbing is their stark contradiction with public virtue. The very same senators who tortured slaves in their lavish homes voted on laws governing public morality. The same matrons who supervised agonies in their households were publicly celebrated for their domestic virtue and piety. The dissonance was not experienced as a contradiction because, in the Roman worldview, slaves were not considered fully human. What was done to them, in the cruel calculus of the elite, simply did not count as doing anything to anyone. But elite Romans did not restrict their transgressive activities solely to those they owned. What they did to each other, often in specific, ritualistic contexts, was equally hidden and, in its own way, equally disturbing. Roman religion was a deeply public and political affair. Temples stood majestically in city centers. Priests held official, state-sanctioned positions. Ceremonies occurred on published calendars, integral to civic life. The gods were civic institutions as much as they were spiritual forces. But alongside this official religion, a shadow world existed. Mystery cults, initiatory religions with secret practices known only to their sworn members. The most famous were the Eleusinian mysteries from Greece, but dozens of others operated throughout the vast Roman world. Elite Romans participated in these cults while publicly maintaining their traditional religious observances, living a double life of faith and ritual. What happened in mystery cult rituals was never, under any circumstances, supposed to be revealed. Initiates took solemn oaths of secrecy, enforced by the terrifying threat of divine punishment and, perhaps more immediately, by death at the hands of fellow initiates. This secrecy was remarkably effective. After centuries of practice involving thousands upon thousands of initiates, the specific, intimate details of most mystery rituals remain profoundly unknown to this day. But fragments have, inevitably, survived. Fleeting references in court cases, indignant accusations from early Christian writers, archaeological evidence from cult sites. Enough survives to indicate that mystery rituals involved experiences that elite Romans could not, under any circumstances, acknowledge publicly. The cult of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and ecstatic frenzy, spread to Rome and was brutally suppressed in 186 years before Christ. The suppression was primarily political, aimed at breaking up powerful, clandestine organizations that operated outside state control. But the charges used to justify this brutal crackdown reveal much about what the cult allegedly practiced. Nocturnal gatherings where normal social boundaries completely dissolved, where participants of both genders engaged in acts that openly violated Roman moral codes, where the rigid distinction between citizen and slave temporarily disappeared in a maelstrom of ecstatic abandon. The suppression killed thousands, but it did not eliminate mystery cults. They simply continued operating, more discreetly, their membership drawn increasingly from elite families whose social position provided a layer of protection that ordinary initiates lacked. A senator, charged with cult participation, could call on powerful friends and political leverage. A common citizen, however, faced the full, unforgiving weight of laws that officially prohibited these dangerous practices. The cult of Isis, the Egyptian goddess of magic and mystery, attracted particularly strong elite participation. Temples to Isis operated openly in Rome despite periodic attempts at suppression. Initiates included senators, their wives, and even members of the imperial family itself. What happened in Isis rituals involved what ancient sources describe as all-night ceremonies from which participants emerged profoundly transformed. A satirist named Apuleius wrote a novel, The Golden Ass, that concludes with a detailed, compelling description of an Isis initiation. The protagonist undergoes rituals that bring him to the very boundary of death and return. He sees vivid visions. He experiences profound ecstasy. He is reborn as a devoted worshipper of the goddess. The description is compelling, but carefully stops short of revealing actual ritual content, maintaining the sacred secrecy, even while powerfully conveying the initiation's emotional and spiritual impact. What archaeologists have found at mystery cult sites strongly suggests physical experiences that went beyond mere symbolic ritual. Specialized chambers for isolation, apparatus for creating intense sensory effects, residues of substances that would have altered consciousness. The initiatory experience was not merely theatrical. It involved genuine alterations of perception, achieved through methods that made the divine seem profoundly present and real. Elite participation in mystery cults served social functions beyond simple spiritual seeking. The shared secret created powerful bonds among initiates that often crossed normal social boundaries. A senator and a merchant who had undergone initiation together shared something profound that neither could acknowledge publicly, but both would remember. The cult network became another intricate layer of elite connection, operating alongside but distinct from official political structures. The early Christian writers, who eventually came to dominate Roman culture, condemned mystery cults as demonic and depraved. Their condemnations, ironically, reveal details that initiates had kept hidden for centuries: the physical practices, the boundary violations, the things done in darkness that could not, by their very nature, be done in light. The Christian eagerness to expose pagan depravity ensures that we know something of what mystery cults involved, even if the full, complete picture remains tantalizingly incomplete.
But mystery cults were episodic experiences, intense but temporary. What elite Roman women did on an ongoing basis, often with specific partners, was an open secret that everyone knew and no one dared to discuss. Gladiators occupied a truly strange, paradoxical position in Roman society. They were slaves or criminals, occupying the very lowest social categories, utterly devoid of rights. Yet, successful gladiators became colossal celebrities, their names known throughout the city, their powerful images reproduced on household items, their fights anticipated with an excitement modern audiences reserve for championship sports. Elite Roman women found gladiators utterly fascinating. This fascination is meticulously documented in sources ranging from passionate poetry to crude graffiti to dry legal records. And this fascination went far beyond a mere appreciation of athletic prowess. It was deeply physical, intensely intimate, and frequently acted upon. A wife of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor himself, was widely rumored to have taken a gladiator as a lover. The rumor even held that the future emperor, Commodus, known for his own later obsession with fighting in the arena, was actually the gladiator's biological son. Whether the rumor was true matters less than the powerful fact that it was so widely believed. The idea of elite women taken gladiator lovers was plausible enough that Romans accepted the story as a shocking yet entirely believable truth. Juvenal, in his satires, dedicated an entire, scathing section to matrons who would abandon their respectable families, their social standing, to follow gladiators. He explicitly named specific women, described specific illicit affairs, and condemned the willing degradation of elite status for physical involvement with slaves. His condemnation, while moralistic, reveals the sheer prevalence of the behavior he was condemning, a pattern widespread enough to warrant extended satirical treatment. The gladiator schools, sprawling, brutal facilities where fighters trained for the arena, became unexpected sites of intense elite female attention. Women found ways to visit, to watch the training, to make direct contact with the specific fighters who attracted their interest. The school owners, pragmatic and financially driven, facilitated these arrangements for appropriate compensation. A successful gladiator, despite his low social standing, could significantly supplement his meager prize money through elite patronage that extended far beyond mere financial support. Graffiti preserved in the ash-buried city of Pompeii includes what can only be called passionate fan messages for gladiators, expressing interest in explicitly physical terms. Some of this graffiti was clearly written by women. The gladiator named Calatus, for example, is described as making girls sigh, the heartthrob of the girls, and similar phrases that explicitly indicate female enthusiasm extending far beyond mere admiration of fighting skill. The arrangement of gladiator encounters required discretion, certainly, but it was far from impossible. Elite women had a surprising degree of mobility. They controlled significant household resources. They could arrange absences and create opportunities, leveraging their status for illicit liaisons. Gladiators, despite their enslaved status, often had access to women that men of far higher status might envy.
The paradox was understood, exploited, and a source of both scandal and fascination. The children born from these illicit unions faced particular complications. A child born to an elite woman was, legally, her husband's, regardless of actual biological paternity. A man might find himself raising children who obviously did not resemble him, children whose true paternity he was unable to acknowledge without publicly shaming himself and his family. The legal system that made legitimate children valuable also made it impossible to publicly discard children whose legitimacy, while legally protected, was privately doubtful.
Some elite men responded to this potent threat to their honor with terrifying violence. A senator during Domitian's reign allegedly killed his wife and the gladiator he found her with, claiming the traditional brutal right of husbands to avenge dishonor through bloodshed. He was acquitted. The case, widely known, established that elite men could respond lethally to their wives' involvement with gladiators, a legal precedent that grimly suggests how frequently such involvement occurred. But the gladiator obsession was merely the most visible form of elite women's quiet sexual autonomy. What happened at the public baths revealed even broader patterns that affected Romans of all genders. Roman baths were architectural marvels, grand public facilities that offered not just hot and cold bathing, but also exercise, massage, and crucial opportunities for socialization.
They were also, crucially, sites of activities that Romans simultaneously practiced and publicly condemned, a stage for hypocrisy. The baths operated with minimal clothing, or often no clothing at all, and a significant degree of gender mixing during certain hours. While separate male and female sections technically existed, movement between them was often possible or easily arranged. Private rooms were readily available for rent. This potent combination of physical exposure, a relaxed, uninhibited atmosphere, and readily accessible private spaces created opportunities that opportunistic bath owners eagerly exploited and bath users, equally eager, enjoyed. The poet Martial, once again, writes repeatedly about what transpired in the baths, often in poems that require careful, nuanced reading to fully understand their scandalous implications. He referenced women who spent excessive amounts of time during mixed bathing hours, far beyond any reasonable need for hygiene. He mentioned men who visited baths for purposes clearly beyond simple cleanliness. He described encounters in private rooms that would have been utterly impossible to arrange anywhere else in Roman society. The baths employed numerous slaves whose duties extended far beyond merely providing towels or scrubbing bodies. Bath attendants included attractive young men and women specifically selected for their looks, who were available for services that supplemented the standard bath experience. Elite patrons could request specific attendance. The requests were implicitly understood. The services were invariably provided. The arrangement was, at its core, commercial, but cleverly disguised as a form of elaborate hospitality. Certain baths became known for specific clienteles. One establishment might attract those seeking partners of a particular type. Another might be known for its unparalleled discretion, making it suitable for married patrons who wish to avoid recognition or scandal. This specialization was never advertised explicitly, but was communicated through subtle networks, whispered among those who knew how to access such information. The Emperor Hadrian, a reformer, attempted to regulate bath behavior by mandating strictly separate hours for men and women. The regulation, predictably, was widely ignored. It was also repeatedly reimposed by subsequent emperors, strongly suggesting that compliance was never truly achieved. The baths remained unique spaces where Roman moral codes were largely suspended, where things happened that simply could not happen in other public venues.
The health justifications for bathing provided a convenient cover for activities that had absolutely nothing to do with health. A matron who spent hours at the baths daily could not easily be questioned. She was, after all, merely maintaining her health, following medical advice, participating in normal Roman social life. What she did during those hours, whom she met, what transpired in those private rooms, this was her business, and not, under the prevailing social codes, subject to inquiry. While elite households often included private bath facilities, many elite Romans preferred the public baths precisely for the unique opportunities they offered. The public setting, ironically, provided a degree of anonymity that private bathing could not. Encounters with strangers carried less risk than encounters with members of one's own social circle. The strange democracy of the baths, where wealth mattered less than physical presence and opportunity, attracted elites seeking experiences their status normally prevented. Archaeological evidence from Roman baths includes rooms whose purposes are strikingly evident from their design. Small chambers with sturdy locking doors, positioned strategically away from main circulation areas, equipped with amenities strongly suggesting extended occupation. These were clearly not mere changing rooms, they were accommodations for activities that demanded both privacy and time. But while the baths offered illicit opportunities for all Romans, elite families maintained exclusive practices in their country properties that no public facility could ever match. Rome itself was a city of relentless scrutiny, a crowded, surveilled, and constrained environment bound tightly by social expectations. For the elite, a profound escape lay in their country villas, where distance from the city meant a liberating distance from constant observation. What transpired at these sprawling estates was protected by their very isolation, by the unswerving loyalty of their numerous slaves, and by a shared, unspoken understanding among neighboring estate owners. Everyone's privacy served everyone's interests. The Bay of Naples, with its breathtaking vistas and temperate climate, attracted a particular concentration of elite villas. Dozens of magnificent properties lined the coast, owned by Rome's wealthiest families, staffed by hundreds of slaves, and designed specifically for forms of entertainment that urban properties simply could not accommodate. Their proximity meant that elite families could visit each other, share resources, and combine forces for events that no single household could manage alone, creating a vibrant, secretive social nexus. A villa discovered at Oplantis, tragically buried by Vesuvius in 79 years after Christ, revealed architecture clearly designed for purposes beyond simple residence. It contained hidden rooms accessible through concealed passages, bathing facilities with unusual, suggestive arrangements, and wall paintings depicting scenes that archaeologists, in their initial reports, declined to publish due to their explicit nature. The villa's owner was known to be connected to the imperial family, and its design strongly suggests entertainments of types that demanded both extensive space and absolute secrecy. The notorious villa at Sperlonga, famously owned by the Emperor Tiberius, featured a dining grotto carved directly into the coastal cliffs. This grotto housed elaborate sculptural groups and a circular pool where diners reclined on platforms that extended into the water. The entire arrangement created an atmosphere that ancient sources describe as conducive to every excess, to indulgence beyond bounds. Diners were surrounded by mythological scenes of metamorphosis and passion, isolated from the world above, free to indulge whatever the setting suggested. Private correspondence from the late Republic often included references to villa entertainments, using language that required careful interpretation. An invitation to spend a week at a friend's villa and enjoy full hospitality implied far more than comfortable accommodation. The phrase known delights indicated, with a knowing wink, that specific amenities, human amenities, would be available. This coded language allowed for clear communication while maintaining a convenient layer of deniability. The slave populations at these villas were selected differently than urban household slaves. Physical beauty was often prioritized. Training emphasized entertainment skills, sometimes with a dark edge. The ratio of attractive young slaves to practical workers far exceeded what legitimate agricultural or domestic needs would justify. The villa's slave complement was effectively a private collection of human beings, curated purely for pleasure rather than productivity. What occurred during these villa parties was occasionally revealed through legal proceedings, usually when arrangements went terribly wrong. A case from Cicero's time involved a young Roman citizen who had been drugged at a villa party and subjected to treatment normally reserved for slaves. His family's prosecution revealed unsettling aspects of villa entertainment that the defendant's lawyers, in their defense, argued were common practice, merely unfortunate in this instance because the victim happened to possess the inviolable rights of citizenship. The villa culture created spaces where the Roman elite could escape not only public observation but also their own identities. Away from Rome, away from formal social roles, surrounded only by compliant slaves and fellow elites who would never speak publicly about what they witnessed, the wealthy could explore desires that urban life vigorously constrained. The villas were laboratories for appetite, maintained at enormous expense, precisely because they enabled what could not be enabled elsewhere. But not all elite secrets required physical isolation. Some operated openly in Rome itself, cleverly disguised by religious or theatrical framing that made transgression appear legitimate. Roman theater existed in a complex, contradictory relationship with Roman morality. Actors were legally infames, stripped of citizen rights, ranked alongside prostitutes in legal status, viewed with disdain. Yet, theater was public entertainment, supported by state funds, attended by all classes, and featured performances that ranged from legitimate drama to explicit displays that amounted to public intimacy. The mimes and pantomimes that dominated late Roman theater featured physical performances that boldly pushed the boundaries of what could display publicly. Performers appeared minimally clothed or entirely unclothed. Performances simulated or sometimes actually depicted intimate acts. The audience watched what could not be done anywhere else, sanctioned by the theatrical context, by the implicit understanding that it was just a play. Elite involvement with theater extended far beyond mere attendance. Wealthy patrons supported acting companies, providing crucial financing in exchange for access to performers. This access was understood to include personal access, private performances, and arrangements that satisfied appetites far beyond aesthetic appreciation. A genre of theatrical entertainment called fabula atellana featured obscene humor and explicit situations, performed by actors whose infamous legal status made them available for whatever patrons desired. Elite homes often hosted private performances of these plays, modified for intimate venues, adjusted to the specific, often peculiar interests of the hosts and their guests. The Emperor Nero famously performed in public theaters, scandalizing traditionalists who believed imperial dignity utterly incompatible with acting. But Nero was only the most visible elite theatrical participant. Others preferred private performances, held in secluded villas or hidden rooms, where they could take on roles that public theater reserved for the infamous. The theatrical framework provided a crucial psychological distance. One was not actually doing these things, one was performing them, playing a part, participating in art. The child performers who appeared in Roman theaters faced particular vulnerabilities. Theater companies often included children, trained from early ages in performance skills that encompassed far more than mere acting. Elite patrons frequently showed intense interest in specific child performers. The companies, dependent on patronage, accommodated these interests for appropriate compensation. The children, utterly devoid of rights, had no voice in these arrangements. They were property, belonging to companies whose income depended on satisfying patron desires.
A legal case from the 2nd century concerned a father who had sold his son to a theatrical company and later sought to recover him. The court proceedings revealed that the son had been assigned duties far beyond performance, duties that the father claimed he had not authorized. The court ruled decisively that the sale had transferred complete rights to the company. What the company did with its property was not subject to the original seller's objections. The theatrical culture, therefore, created a space where Roman moral codes were officially suspended. What happened on stage was not real. What happened backstage was not public. What happened between patrons and performers was a private arrangement between owner and property. The theater thus provided systematic access to experiences that Roman law theoretically prohibited, but theatrical convention practically enabled. But theatrical arrangements served elite interests only occasionally. What wealthy Romans imported from conquered territories served those interests continuously, systematically expanding their repertoire of pleasure. Rome conquered the Mediterranean world and, in doing so, absorbed its practices. From Egypt, from Syria, from Asia Minor, from dozens of other conquered regions came customs and traditions and vices that profoundly transformed Roman elite culture. These Eastern imports included human beings specifically selected for characteristics that Roman slave dealers knew elite buyers would pay premium prices for. Egypt supplied boys trained in arts that Egyptian temples had refined over millennia. Syria supplied girls whose preparation included techniques that Syrian traditions had developed. Each conquered region contributed its unique specialties to an imperial market that shrewdly combined them all. A dealer in the 1st century specialized in what he explicitly called Eastern delights, slaves from conquered territories who had been rigorously trained in their homelands before transport to Rome. His marketing emphasized the exotic, the different, the techniques utterly unknown to Italian slaves. Elite buyers paid extraordinary prices for the promise of experiences their Roman possessions could not provide. The conquered peoples brought their gods as well, and their rituals. The cult of Cybele from Asia Minor featured priests who had castrated themselves in ecstatic ceremony. The cult of Astarte from Syria involved temple practices that Romans found simultaneously horrifying and fascinating. These religions, with their foreign allure, attracted elite initiates who sought experiences that traditional Roman traditions simply did not offer. The Eastern influence on elite intimate practices can be subtly traced through vocabulary itself. Latin acquired new terms from Greek, Syrian, and Egyptian languages for acts and arrangements that Latin had previously lacked words to describe. The linguistic borrowing is a clear indicator of cultural borrowing. Romans learned practices from their conquered subjects and needed new words to discuss them, to categorize them, to possess them. A satirist from the 2nd century mocks elite Romans who travel to Alexandria specifically to learn what Alexandria teaches about pleasure. The mockery, while humorous, reveals a distinct travel pattern. Wealthy Romans visited Egypt not only for tourism, but for a perverse education in arts that Egyptian civilization had systematized over centuries. They returned to Rome with new knowledge, with exquisitely trained slaves, with exotic equipment, with appetites expanded by exposure to possibilities they had not previously imagined. The Eastern imports transformed Roman elite culture across centuries. By the late Empire, Practices that early Romans would have considered foreign perversions had become entirely normalized among the wealthy, part of their everyday, hidden lives. The consumption of conquered cultures included the consumption of their approaches to intimacy, their trained specialists, their accumulated knowledge of pleasure and its most refined techniques. This importation operated through intricate networks that connected elite households across the entire Mediterranean. A wealthy Roman in Antioch might acquire slaves or knowledge that would be shipped directly to relatives in Rome. A merchant traveling for business might fulfill special commissions for elite patrons seeking particular exotic imports. These networks ensured that whatever one conquered territory offered would become available throughout the entire Roman elite world.
But not all elite secrets involved pleasure or gratification. Some involved far darker rituals that surrounded death itself, blurring the line between reverence and desecration. Roman funerals for elite families were elaborate public spectacles. Grand processions snaked through city streets. Ancestor masks, effigies of venerated forebears, were displayed prominently. Eulogies, ringing with hyperbolic praise, were delivered in the Forum, Rome's public heart. The death of a prominent Roman was a community event, witnessed by thousands, meticulously recorded in histories, and commemorated through imposing monuments.
What happened in private, however, before and after the public funeral followed entirely different, hidden patterns. The preparation of bodies was conducted by specialized professionals, many of them slaves, whose work required intimate, often unsettling handling of corpses. The embalmers and dressers who prepared the elite dead were selected for their absolute discretion as much as for their skill. What they saw, what they did in those hushed, solemn chambers was never, ever discussed publicly. Certain practices around elite death appear in sources that mention them only to condemn or deny them. The preservation of specific body parts as relics. The consultation of the dead through rituals that required physical access to remains, hinting at necromancy. The treatment of corpses in ways that openly violated official religious prohibitions against disturbing the dead. A scandal during Tiberius's reign involved accusations that an elite family had desecrated an enemy's corpse after his execution. The specific desecrations were deemed too disturbing to record fully, but the court proceedings reveal that the family had retained the body for private treatment before permitting public burial. What happened during that retention was apparently extreme enough to warrant prosecution, despite the family's immense status. The funeral feasts that followed burial often extended Roman dining practices into a morbid context. Sources suggest that these feasts sometimes included activities that the deceased would have enjoyed, recreated as a tribute or as a continuation of their life's pleasures, even in death. The funeral feast for a man known for particular appetites might, disturbingly, include those appetites as part of the commemoration. The memorial practices at elite tombs went beyond simple offerings of food and wine. Certain tombs included facilities for activities that simple remembrance would not require. The tomb of the freedman Eurysacis, a wealthy baker, included an elaborate dining area. Other tombs contained chambers whose purposes remain debated by archaeologists, but whose designs strongly suggest private activities rather than mere public commemoration. The cult of dead ancestors that permeated Roman religion created intimate connections between the living and the dead that operated differently than modern sensibilities expect. Ancestors were considered present in the household. Their images looked down from walls. Their approval was sought for major decisions.
The physical remains of ancestors, preserved in household shrines or family tombs, were objects of an ongoing, personal relationship rather than simply memorials. Elite families maintained these relationships through practices that sources describe vaguely: consultations with the dead, rituals at tombs that required absolute privacy, treatments of remains that kept ancestors physically present in ways that official religion did not sanction. The practices were hidden because they violated public norms. They persisted because they satisfied deep psychological needs that public religion did not meet. But funeral practices affected only the dead. What elite Romans did with the living who were not quite family represented another category of hidden, exploitative behavior. Elite Roman households typically included children who were not the biological offspring of the family. These foster children, known as alumni, occupied an ambiguous status, hovering precariously between family member and slave. They were raised with the family's legitimate children, educated similarly, often indulged, but crucially lacked inheritance rights and the legal protections that legitimate children possessed. The selection of alumni follow patterns that sources acknowledge only obliquely. Beautiful children were preferred. Specific physical characteristics often mattered. The children were acquired young, raised in intimacy with the family, and served purposes that their ambiguous, unprotected status facilitated. A letter from Pliny the Younger mourns the death of a young alumna from his household. His grief seems genuine, almost excessive, for someone who was not family. He describes her beauty, her charm, her physical development. The letter reveals an affection that later centuries would find deeply disturbing. Affection for a child whose presence in his household was not explained by any family relationship, but by something far more ambiguous. The alumnus system provided elite households with children who were available in ways that legitimate children were not. They could be given away, sold, or disposed of without the legal complications attending actual offspring. They could be used in arrangements that family honor would not permit for biological children. Their intermediate status made them useful precisely because it denied them the protections that status conferred. What became of alumni as they matured varied by household and by individual. Some were freed and established in independent life, often with minimal resources. Some were married to other alumni or to slaves in arrangements the family orchestrated. Many simply disappear from records as they aged out of whatever utility had motivated their acquisition. A legal case from the late Republic concerned an alumnus who claimed he had been promised freedom and citizenship upon reaching adulthood. The family denied any such promise. The case revealed that the alumnus had served the household in capacities that went far beyond normal domestic duties, capacities that the family's lawyers argued were appropriate given his unfree status. The court ruled for the family. The alumnus remained property. The alumni children were visible in elite households but invisible in discussion. Everyone knew they existed. Everyone understood their ambiguous, vulnerable position. But no one discussed what that position actually entailed, what it demanded. This collective silence protected the families who benefited from the system and exposed the children whom the system used and abused. Elite Romans justified the alumnus system through the language of charity. They claimed they were rescuing children who would otherwise face worse fates. They were providing education and opportunity. They were acting as benefactors to those who could not benefit themselves. This convenient justification obscured profound exploitation behind a veneer of benevolence, making criticism seem ungrateful for generosity rather than an appropriate response to abuse. But even the alumni had defined, if precarious, positions. What elite Romans did to those entirely outside any protection,
Those deemed criminals or enemies of the state revealed the system's full, terrifying capacity for cruelty. Roman criminal law explicitly permitted punishments that served entertainment purposes. Criminals condemned to death could be killed in ways that provided spectacle for public audiences, a fusion of justice and gruesome entertainment. This created opportunities that elite Romans exploited far beyond the public arenas.
The damnati ad bestias, those condemned to the beasts, were criminals sentenced to die through animal attack in the arena. Elite Romans could, shockingly, purchase these condemned criminals for private entertainments that replicated arena deaths on a smaller, more intimate scale in their own villas. The legal transfer was chillingly simple. The criminal had been condemned to death by a specific method. Providing that death privately rather than publicly remained within legal parameters. Private beast fights occurred at elite villas where criminals were provided to wild animals for the macabre entertainment of dinner guests. The accounts suggest that these private spectacles allowed for elaborations and perversions that public arenas constrained. The criminals could be prepared in specific ways, perhaps starved or drugged. They could face animals selected for particular characteristics, bred for ferocity.
They could die in sequences designed for maximum impact on intimate audiences, a bespoke performance of terror. The sexual dimension of arena violence is documented in sources that discuss it with evident discomfort and veiled horror. Criminals, particularly those condemned to death, were sometimes subjected to intimate assaults before or even during their deaths, for the titillation of certain audiences. The combination of violence and violation created spectacles that public arenas could not openly display, but that private venues could stage without restriction or moral qualm. A fragment from a legal commentator discusses the chilling question of whether a criminal condemned to death could be subjected to treatment beyond the sentence imposed. The discussion, though legalistic, reveals that such treatment routinely occurred. The commentator's concern was not whether it happened, but whether it was technically legal. His cold conclusion: once condemned, a criminal had no remaining rights. Whatever was done before or during execution was entirely within the condemning authority's discretion. Elite patrons commissioned specific deaths for their entertainments. A criminal might be costumed to represent a mythological figure and killed in a manner matching the myth, perhaps reenacting a tragic hero's demise. This staging required meticulous planning, significant resources, and a grotesque creative vision. The deaths became performances, scripts written by wealthy patrons and enacted on condemned bodies. The children of criminals could be sold into slavery when their parents were executed. Elite buyers acquired these children knowing their origins, sometimes because of their origins. The children of traitors, of murderers, of enemies provided a particular, perverse satisfaction when owned by those who had engineered their parents' downfall. The possession was a trophy. The child's service was an ongoing, daily victory, a constant reminder of power. This entire system operated through intermediaries who carefully insulated elite patrons from direct involvement. Agents attended auctions. Dealers provided specific acquisitions. The patron's hands remained clean. The patron's entertainment was provided. The system's efficiency ensured that elite desires found satisfaction within legal frameworks that nominally prohibited what actually occurred. But legal entertainment was merely one dimension of elite transgression. What wealthy Romans did through their political influence exceeded even what they did through commercial transactions. Roman politics operated through intricate personal relationships rather than purely institutional processes. Alliances were sealed through arrangements that extended far beyond mere policy agreement. The favor trading that characterized elite politics included favors that would never be mentioned in speeches or recorded in histories. The sharing of intimate resources cemented political alliances. A senator seeking another senator's crucial support might provide access to household members whose availability demonstrated profound trust and created mutual vulnerability. This exchange created bonds far stronger than mere political agreement. Both parties had compromised themselves in ways that made betrayal incredibly dangerous. A speech by Cicero, attacking his archenemy Clodius, famously references arrangements of this type without describing them explicitly. Cicero accuses Clodius of using his own sister in political negotiations, essentially providing her to allies whose support he desperately needed. The accusation was scandalous enough that Cicero assumed his audience would immediately understand the damning implications. Clodius's political success, Cicero's accusation suggests, was built partly on his willingness to deploy family members in arrangements that more honorable men would steadfastly refuse. The political marriages that united elite families were explicitly transactional. Daughters were assigned to husbands whose political value to their fathers far outweighed any consideration of the daughter's preferences or welfare. The daughters themselves understood their function. They were diplomatic instruments, their bodies sealing alliances that their fathers' words could not adequately guarantee. What happened within these political marriages depended heavily on the individuals involved. Some, by sheer chance, developed genuine partnerships. Others remained functional hostilities, spouses who fulfilled public duties while pursuing private interests separately, their political purpose having been served. The marriage itself, then, mattered less than the alliance it symbolized. The political use of intimate scandal as a weapon was systematic and ruthless. Elite Romans meticulously gathered information about rivals' private conduct, holding it in reserve for deployment when political circumstances warranted. This information was obtained through slaves who reported household activities, through keen observers at private entertainments, through the intricate networks of gossip and information that permeated elite society. A politician whose private conduct could not withstand exposure was profoundly vulnerable to rivals who possessed such damning evidence. The mere threat of exposure could compel policy concessions, force withdrawal from competitions, or effectively end careers without requiring actual public disclosure. The weapon was often more effective held in reserve than used openly. Everyone knew these threats existed. Everyone calculated their own vulnerability. The political dimension utterly transformed private conduct into public liability. What a senator did in his own household became potential ammunition for his enemies. The surveillance was mutual. Everyone watched everyone else. Everyone gathered information. Everyone recognized that their own conduct was being similarly observed and recorded. This mutual surveillance might have been expected to constrain behavior. Instead, it created a pervasive, collective vulnerability. Everyone had secrets. Everyone knew other secrets. This mutual exposure created a kind of perverse stability. No one could expose others without risking exposure themselves. The result was not virtue, but silent complicity, an elite bound together by shared transgression that none could acknowledge without simultaneously acknowledging their own. But not all elite secrets were systematically hidden. Some were known to everyone and simply never mentioned directly. Every Roman of elite status knew things that were never written down. The true identities of children whose paternity differed from their official parentage, the intimate arrangements that explained unexpected political alliances,
The unspoken reasons certain families conspicuously avoided each other at public events. The true explanations for sudden changes in fortune that official accounts blandly attributed to chance. These open secrets circulated through oral transmission, passed from parent to child, from patron to client, from friend to friend. They constituted a shadow history that supplemented the official record, explaining what written sources left unexplained, filling gaping holes that formal histories could not or dared not acknowledge. The slave who killed the Senator Lucius Pedanius Secundus in the 1st century was publicly unknown in motive. The entire slave household, 400 people, was executed according to a brutal Roman law that held all slaves responsible when one killed a master. But elite Romans knew why the slave had killed him, understood the unbearable provocation that had driven him to fatal action. This knowledge circulated through hushed conversations that left no record. The public mystery was, for them, a private certainty. Elite women were particularly crucial custodians of these open secrets. They knew which marriages were genuine partnerships and which were mere facades. They knew the real relationships behind public displays of affection. They knew which children truly resembled their official fathers and which did not. This intimate knowledge was women's currency, subtly traded among themselves, deployed in the intricate, often cruel, social competitions that elite women conducted parallel to their husbands' public conflicts. The open secrets included knowledge of practices that could not be discussed in any other form. Everyone knew which senators had particular, unspoken preferences. Everyone knew which matrons made particular, discreet arrangements. Everyone knew which families maintained particular, notorious establishments. The knowledge was universal. The silence was equally universal. Speaking openly about open secrets violated social norms far more fundamental than the secrets themselves. A man named Publius Clodius Pulcher was notoriously discovered at a women-only religious ceremony, the rites of the Bona Dea, in Sammadasau's high years before Christ. His presence was sacrilege. His motive, according to the open secret everyone knew, was the pursuit of Julius Caesar's wife, Pompeia. The subsequent trial and Clodius's acquittal were public events. But the actual arrangement between Clodius and Pompeia, and its continuation despite the scandal, remained an open secret that everyone knew and no one dared to state explicitly. The open secret system served social functions far beyond simple gossip. It created graduated levels of inclusion. Those who knew particular secrets were insiders. Those who did not were outsiders. The knowledge itself became currency, traded for other knowledge, used to establish relationships and demonstrate trustworthiness. A man who could be trusted with secrets could be trusted with other confidences. The secrets were tests of reliability. Elite Romans learned to navigate this complex system from childhood. They learned what could be said and what could only be known. They learned to communicate through implication rather than direct statement. They learned that words often had two meanings: the surface meaning, available to everyone, and the deeper, true meaning, available only to those who understood the context of open secrets. This system continues, in modified forms, wherever elites operate. The modern gossip networks that circulate information about powerful people. The knowledge that insiders share about public figures' private conduct. The persistent gap between official biography and understood reality. All these echoed the Roman open secret system. Power generates secrets. Secrets generate a particular kind of solidarity among those who share them. The dynamics are constant, unchanging across cultures and centuries. This brings us to the final secret, the one that encompasses all others. The Roman elite tried to drastically destroy the evidence of their own conduct. This is the ultimate secret, the one that explains why so much has been lost, and why what survives appears in tantalizing fragments rather than complete, coherent accounts. The destruction was systematic and deliberate. Private letters were burned by recipients who understood their incriminating potential. Household records were purged when families faced political difficulties. Slaves who knew too much were sold to distant provinces or simply made to disappear. The infrastructure of secrecy extended even to the ruthless destruction of evidence that secrecy itself might fail to protect.
When Christianity became Rome's official religion in the 4th century, the new authorities conducted an additional, comprehensive wave of destruction. Texts that revealed pagan elite conduct were targeted as both immoral and irreligious. This potent combination of moral outrage and theological mandate produced sweeping purges of written material that had miraculously survived centuries of previous erasure. What survives does so accidentally, miraculously. The texts that Vesuvius buried at Pompeii and Herculaneum escaped the purges that destroyed their copies elsewhere. The graffiti on walls, deemed too trivial to warrant systematic destruction, was also too permanent to easily remove. Legal records were preserved for their procedural value, their incriminating content apparently overlooked by the diligent but perhaps unperceptive archivists who maintained them. The archaeology of destruction itself tells a story. Villa sites where specific, problematic rooms were meticulously dismantled before abandonment. Archives where distinct burn layers indicate deliberate destruction rather than accidental fire. Tombs whose original, explicit inscriptions were erased and replaced with bland, generic epitaphs. The physical evidence of erasure reveals how profoundly important concealment was to those who practiced it. The destruction continued after antiquity. Medieval monks, painstakingly copying classical texts, sometimes declined to copy sections they deemed too offensive or immoral. Their selectivity further reduced what survived. Renaissance scholars who rediscovered classical material sometimes suppressed what they found, judging certain texts too dangerous for circulation, too shocking for the public. Each generation of transmission provided an opportunity for additional erasure. What we know about Roman elite conduct comes from material that escaped multiple generations of deliberate destruction. The survivors are fragments, hints, subtle implications that require immense scholarly reconstruction to become coherent narratives. The full, complete picture is permanently lost. The darkness into which the destroyed evidence vanished will never be fully illuminated. This erasure itself constitutes powerful evidence. The systematic, relentless effort to destroy records of elite conduct proves, beyond doubt, that there was something profoundly worth destroying. The comprehensiveness of the destruction proves that the conduct was not isolated incidents, but pervasive, systemic patterns. The persistence of this destruction across centuries proves that what was being hidden was understood to be damaging across wildly changing cultural contexts. The Roman elite knew precisely what they were doing. They knew it violated their own professed standards of virtue and morality. They knew that evidence of their conduct would severely damage their reputations and their families' positions for generations. They invested enormous effort in concealment while they lived and in erasure after they died. That monumental investment proves the immense value they placed on hiding what they had done. What survives despite this monumental effort represents only a fraction of what existed.
For every scandal we know about, dozens were successfully hidden. For every practice we can document, countless others were concealed effectively enough that no evidence remains. The fragments we possess are mere glimpses through narrow gaps in a curtain that was, for the most part, devastatingly successful in hiding what lay behind it.
This is why these stories matter, not because they represent complete knowledge of Roman elite conduct, but because they represent the incomplete knowledge that survived despite comprehensive, systematic efforts at erasure. If this is what escaped, imagine what did not. You have now heard 17 categories of Roman elite secrets that ancient sources documented, often reluctantly, despite systematic erasure. The question that remains is what this history means for understanding human society more broadly, for understanding ourselves. The Roman elite were not uniquely corrupt. They were, perhaps, typically corrupt in ways that recur whenever a class possesses immense wealth and unchecked power without accountability. The specific practices may vary by culture and technology.
But the underlying patterns, the exploitation of the powerless, the stark hypocrisy of private conduct contradicting public virtue, the systematic concealment of what concealment cannot morally rehabilitate, these patterns appear in every aristocracy that historians have studied. The Roman evidence is invaluable precisely because so much survived despite deliberate erasure. The Romans, for all their destructive tendencies, left more documentation than most ancient civilizations. The sheer extent of their empire ensured that copies of texts existed in multiple locations, some of which, by sheer chance, escaped destruction. Their profound cultural influence on subsequent civilizations ensured a continued interest in their records, a reason to preserve them. We know more about Roman elite conduct than we know about comparable elites elsewhere. This knowledge serves as a crucial template for recognizing these enduring patterns in other contexts. The slave market selections have chilling parallels in every society that has practiced slavery. The poison networks have parallels in every aristocracy whose inheritance laws created powerful incentives for murder. The private punishments have parallels wherever absolute authority over others has existed, wherever human beings have been treated as property. The Roman evidence illuminates universal human dynamics through specific, stark examples. The erasure attempts themselves follow universal patterns. Every elite tries to hide what would damage its legitimacy, what would expose its hypocrisy. Every power structure invests heavily in controlling its own narrative. The Roman efforts were perhaps more systematic and, ironically, better documented than most, but they were not fundamentally different in kind from efforts that continue today. Modern elites maintain privacy through sophisticated legal mechanisms, through non-disclosure agreements, through public relations, rather than slave loyalty and wholesale text destruction. But the underlying dynamic, the persistent gap between public presentation and private conduct, persists. The powerful still have secrets. They still invest enormous resources in concealing those secrets. And they still face occasional, unavoidable exposure that reveals what concealment normally hides. The Roman sources that condemn elite conduct often did so for political rather than purely moral reasons. Cicero attacked Claudius because they were bitter enemies, not because Cicero's own conduct was exemplary or spotless. Juvenal satirized elite women because satire sold, because it was popular, not necessarily because he was genuinely outraged by the specific acts themselves. The moralistic framing of our ancient sources should not obscure the fact that the evidence they provide was generated by complex, often self-interested motivations. But the evidence remains valid regardless of why it was produced. A political enemy may have biased reasons for revealing secrets, but the secrets revealed are no less real for that bias.
The Roman sources tell us what happened, even when their reasons for telling us were entirely self-interested. The 17 secrets we have explored tonight have a contemporary relevance that extends far beyond mere historical interest. Modern wealthy families still practice forms of selection in acquiring domestic workers, forms that echo the delicia market in their underlying dehumanization. They still maintain private spaces where conduct differs dramatically from public presentation. They still use intermediaries to insulate themselves from direct involvement in questionable arrangements.
The specific mechanisms differ, certainly, from Roman slave markets and villa entertainments, but the fundamental social dynamics that create the desire for such mechanisms persist, unchanging. Modern political arrangements still include intimate dimensions that participants meticulously conceal from public knowledge. The favor trading that characterizes elite politics still extends beyond policy into intensely personal territory. The mutual vulnerability created by shared secrets still binds political allies more effectively than shared ideology or even shared principles. Modern erasure of inconvenient evidence continues, albeit through different technologies. Digital records can be deleted with a click. Non-disclosure agreements can legally silence witnesses. Legal threats can suppress publication. The comprehensive destruction that Roman elites practiced has modern equivalents that serve identical purposes. The structural factors that enabled Roman elite conduct, the immense concentration of wealth, the legal impunity enjoyed by the powerful, the ownership of other human beings, these have not disappeared but have merely transformed. Extreme wealth concentration has, disturbingly, returned to levels comparable to Roman inequality. Legal systems still, in practice, provide more protection for the wealthy than for others. Human trafficking continues, providing countless victims for exploitation that differs in form but not in essence from Roman slavery. Understanding Roman elite secrets helps us to recognize their modern manifestations. The forms change, but the patterns persist. A modern Vidius Pollio would not feed slaves to lampreys. He would find other expressions for the same impulses, other ways to assert absolute dominance, expressions that his immense wealth would protect from consequence, just as effectively as Roman wealth protected Roman cruelty. The silence that surrounded Roman elite conduct has chilling modern parallels as well. The open secrets that everyone knew and no one stated directly exist in contemporary elite circles. The graduated knowledge that distinguishes insiders from outsiders continues to function. The currency of confidential information still purchases access and alliance. We began in the lavish villa of Marcus Vidius Pollio, watching a young slave named Demetrius dragged toward a pond filled with hungry eels because he had spilled 3 drops of wine. We have traveled through moitain categories of Roman elite secrets that starkly reveal what wealth and power without accountability inevitably become. The Roman elite were not monsters, not entirely. They were ordinary people, perhaps no better and no worse than elites throughout history, operating within systems that enabled their worst impulses while simultaneously requiring them to maintain carefully constructed facades of virtue. Their public selves built magnificent monuments, wrote profound philosophy, and governed an empire that shaped subsequent civilization. Their private selves did things that those monuments and philosophies and governance structures were meticulously designed to hide. The gap between public and private is precisely where public and private is precisely where power's true, often brutal nature becomes visible. What people do when they believe no one is watching, or when everyone watching is complicit, reveals what their public presentation carefully conceals. The Roman elite believed they were unobserved, beyond consequence. They were wrong. Fragments escaped. Witnesses recorded what they saw. Evidence accumulated despite generations of deliberate erasure. The slaves who served elite households were the primary witnesses. Their testimony survives in glimpses, in records made when slaves were questioned about household matters for legal proceedings, in graffiti written by literate slaves who wanted someone, anyone, to know what they had experienced. The voiceless were not completely silent. Their fragments contradict the official narratives that elite self-presentation so carefully produced. The women of elite households were secondary witnesses. They knew what happened in spaces designated for women, away from male eyes. They knew what their husbands did and what they themselves did in secret. Their knowledge surfaces in sources written by men who learned from women, who recorded what women told them, who, perhaps inadvertently, preserved female perspectives despite cultural assumptions that women's knowledge was less valuable than men's. The Roman elite tried, with monumental effort, to control history itself. They built monuments to their public virtues. They commissioned histories that emphasized their contributions to Rome. They destroyed every piece of evidence of their private conduct. They almost succeeded. Almost. What survived, however, is enough. Enough to recognize the patterns. Enough to understand the dynamics. Enough to see through facades that time and deliberate erasure have made incomplete, perhaps, but not invisible. The 17 secrets we have explored tonight are windows into a world that desperately wanted to remain hidden. That world was not completely successful in hiding itself. Remember the slave Demetrius, whose minor accident nearly cost him his life. Remember that the guest who saved him did so despite overwhelming social pressure, despite the profound cost to himself, despite a system that explicitly told him his intervention was wrong. The guest's name was not recorded, his identity was not preserved for history, but his action was. Someone, somewhere, thought it was worth remembering that once someone said no. That no matters. It matters because it proves that even within systems of comprehensive exploitation and pervasive cruelty, individuals could choose differently. It matters because it demonstrates that the conduct we have described was not inevitable, was not beyond objection, was not the only possibility. Romans themselves recognized that what elites did was wrong, even if most declined to say so, too fearful or too complicit. The Roman elite are long gone. Their villas have crumbled into dust and ruins. Their monuments stand empty, testaments to forgotten glory. Their names are remembered primarily by historians and curious tourists. But what they showed us about human nature remains chillingly relevant. The capacity for cruelty when power permits it. The stark hypocrisy of public virtue masking private vice. The systematic erasure of inconvenient truth. These are not uniquely Roman characteristics. They are human characteristics, illuminated by the Roman evidence with a particular, terrifying clarity. If you found this exploration valuable, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Share this video with anyone who thinks Roman civilization was simply marble monuments and dignified senatorial debates. Comment below telling me what other historical secrets you want investigated. These stories matter because they reveal patterns that persist in modified forms today. These victims matter because their suffering was real and should not be erased simply because their oppressors wished it erased. These patterns matter because recognizing them in historical form helps us to identify them in contemporary manifestations. The fragments that survive Roman erasure speak across 2,000 years. They tell us what power without accountability becomes. They show us what wealth without restraint permits.
They warn us about what happens when some humans are granted absolute authority over others. The warning is not ancient, it is eternal. See you in the next video, where we will continue uncovering the buried truths that those with power have always tried to hide và đã never completely succeeded trong hiding.